Alright, greetings everybody, and welcome to our continued series on themes of the 20th century. This is the fourth part, the fourth lecture in this series, which starts with the causes of World War I. There's two lectures on the First World War, and this one, of course, concludes the First World War. The way the First World War ended, there was a lot of unanswered questions. And maybe there were questions that people didn't want to ask. You know, when the Germans signed the armistice on November 11th, 1918, that's pretty well precisely what they thought they were signing, was an armistice, which was an agreement to disengage and to cease fighting. What was going to happen after that? Nobody was really asking those questions at that point, but I think there was an assumption by Germany that they would be treated like a equal player amongst the nations of Europe. One of the things that always kind of startles me a bit when I look at how this conference, the Paris Peace Conferences, how they ended, is the fact that I often wonder to what extent did the decision makers in Paris look back at the last major treaty concluded in Europe in 1815, the Congress of Vienna it was called. And the Congress of Vienna came in at the close of the Napoleonic War. So remember Napoleon, he's exiled to Elba, he comes back, and then there's the Battle of Waterloo, which ends it for Napoleon, and then of course the Congress of Vienna concludes all that. One of the things that Britain, Russia, and Prussia were most concerned about were laying the seeds of revenge in the French. So what they did was they invited French diplomats to be part of the discussions, at least to be an ear in the discussions. Now, while the French couldn't participate in the decision-making of the Congress of Vienna, they were there as gentlemen sitting at the table and listening. And the purpose of doing this was to ensure, as I said, that you do not lay the seeds of revenge. Make them feel part of a community of nations. We have to move on, we have to rebuild, and we have to move forward. To me, when I look at the outcome of the Paris Peace Conferences, I can't help but wonder why the decision was made to completely isolate, ostracize, and punish Germany. I mean, on one level, I understand that there was a lot of pent-up anger. But unfortunately, I think when the Treaty of Versailles and the other treaties at Paris are written up, they're done so at a time when nations are still dealing with a lot of frustration and anger and resentment. And maybe a couple more years should have gone by for the dust to settle before they got together and wrote this thing up. But as it is, the treaty and the Paris Peace Conference are what they are, and the results, of course, are very well recorded in history. So what I want to do first is look at some of the results of World War I, just sort of broad sweeping results. And like I've said before, and as I always do in my lectures, I would encourage you to have a look at the three lectures, one dealing with the causes of the war and the two that deal with the war itself. The second part of the two-part series on World War I ends with quite a discussion about the November 11th circumstance, and that will help you understand where we're beginning today. So I would recommend having a look at that just for that continuity. So what we see happening at the end of the Great War is the end of so many empires. The Ottoman Empire, or first the German Empire, Kaiser Wilhelm, and the Second Reich, the Second Empire, ceases to exist and becomes well, it's not even a constitutional monarchy rather, it becomes a democracy. Russia is no longer a czarist domain. It is now in the hands of a new government. And of course, in 1919, everybody was wondering what exactly is happening in Russia and what will be the outcome of the Civil War. So Russia is no longer a monarchy. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and out of the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is born. So many nations, Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and many, many others. And of course, the Ottoman Empire ceases to exist. So, you know, you're dealing with a very complex dynamic, because out of the breakup of these nations, particularly the Russian, the Ottoman, and the Austro-Hungarian, is with that surge of nationalism that we saw as one of the main contributing factors to the outbreak of World War I. Nationalist urges just continue, and out of that is a desire for so many ethnic minorities throughout these old empires to establish new nations, new autonomous nations. And of course they're looking to Woodrow Wilson, whose hallmark statement was national self-determination. So a lot of very interesting dynamics occurring at the Paris Peace Conferences. 10 million people had been killed in the Great War, 16 million people were wounded, and 37 million people were casualties. You know, one of the questions that my students ask me, and have asked many times before, is what is the difference between a casualty and a death? And, well, a death is a casualty, but a casualty is someone who is directly impacted by the war. So for example, if a soldier dies, then his wife and children and his family are casualties. So the Paris Peace Conference ran from January 18th, 1919, just 2 months after the armistice of November 11th, and continued until January 20th, 1920. And this conference would determine the fate of the losing powers. The victors, because of course the losing powers were not invited until the very end to sign their respective peace treaties, it took 1 year for nations to hammer out how Europe was going to look, and who was going to get what, and who was going to have to pay what, and how big was Hungary going to be, and so on and so forth. This was a painstaking process because so many new nations were born as well. So, as I said before, the conference was a gathering only of victors. Defeated powers were not allowed representation at the conference. So their voice was not welcome. And I think right off the bat, this new German government, which was still very young, you have to consider when the Paris Peace Conferences began, the Weimar Republic, as it would later be called, was only 2 months old. And they were struggling with so many variables in dealing with that transition from an absolute monarchy, essentially, to a democracy, and lots of things going on in Germany at the time. Here are kind of the main players. The term the Big Three is thrown around. Of course, there were four to begin with. Italy was considered one of the big players, the victors, but Vittorio Orlando was the name of the Italian leader. He would leave Paris halfway through the conferences in the summer of 1919 because he was absolutely angry with unkept promises. And I'm going to talk about those unkept promises when we get to Italy as well. So really, when we're talking about the Big Three, we're talking about Woodrow Wilson of the United States. We're talking about George Clemenceau of France. We're also talking about the first, and I believe only, Welsh Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. And here's Vittorio Orlando at the end, right? And same down here. You can see Wilson, Clemenceau, Orlando, and Lloyd George. All of whom had a very, very particular interest in what they wanted to achieve coming out of these conferences in Paris. So, all right, well, let's start with George Clemenceau. I wanted to really kind of dig into the personality of these people, because I think you've probably heard me say before, if you've seen my lectures before, that I'm very much focused on personality. Now, while I don't have a psychology background, I have a history and a literature background. I've always been very fascinated by personality and how personality can impact leadership. How does personality impact one's ability to be good at interpersonal skills and all those kind of things? And, you know, who are the introverts, who are the extroverts? Because I do believe that personality plays a tremendous role in leadership and how a leadership leads. I mean, all you have to do is look at, for example, as a reference point, the varying leadership styles in the United States. When you look at the differences in leadership between, say, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Now, aside from their policies, when you look at either one of those two leaders, you see a very, very different type of leadership presentation. And, you know, and in many ways, of course, Donald Trump's personality guides his policies and guides what he says. And unfortunately, what he says oftentimes he probably shouldn't say. But Barack Obama was a little bit more, he was charming, good sense of humor, he was comfortable with himself. He made people around him comfortable. So it's a very interesting study in leadership, aside from policy, more the personality piece. Now, Clemenceau was French. He was old enough, look at, he was born in 1841, he was considerably older than the other two leaders, Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George. So he comes into this thing right off the bat, I'm the older, more experienced. He was 30 years old during the Prussian occupation of France when, of course, they declared their own republic. So he has a memory and history going way, way back. So his resentment had been bubbling towards Germany for a long time. You also have to consider that it was in France where the vast majority of damage was done. When the war ended, Great Britain went back home. They dealt with all the trauma, of course, of traumatized, shell-shocked soldiers. And they dealt with the numbers, the amount of soldiers that were killed and wounded. But once they got home, across the channel, there was no evidence of the war in front of them. Same with the Americans and the Canadians, for that matter. The French, though, there was a constant visual symbol and evidence of this horrific war. Millions of acres of agricultural land had been deemed useless. You know, some of my students said, well, could they just till the land and throw seed on it? Well, yeah, eventually, but what is in the earth? Body parts, shrapnel, gasoline, oil, fuel. You need that earth to settle for years. It's like a gas station. When a gas station closes, you'll notice that the land stays dormant for years because the oils and the gasoline all has to seep deep into the ground and sort of get absorbed into the earth and sent in all kinds of directions. Hopefully not in our water supply system, but it's the same kind of thing. You know, it was in France, right? And out of that reality, you see a much greater degree of anger and hatred coming out of France towards Germany as a result. So his policies were motivated by temperament rather than doctrinaire principles. What I mean by that is he was a tiger. His nickname, the Tiger, was because he was strong-willed and loud and demanding, and he was going to embody the frustration and anger of French, and we are going to make Germany pay. That was the central theme of Clemenceau. He was a patriot and a fighter, not necessarily an eloquent statesman. Now, that is not a criticism. I do not mean to suggest that he wasn't intelligent. His concern was to get payback for this war. Bottom line, we are going to get back everything that we lost. His nickname, as I said, was the Tiger for his audacious and oftentimes boisterous sort of antics. He was very animated, very colorful. I think at times he overwhelmed Wilson, who was quite a bit more reserved, more conservative in terms of his presentation, and Clemenceau could come on a little bit strong at times. I think I know that he drove Lloyd George crazy at times as well. His prime concern at the conference was to ensure that Germany remained weak by taking away parts of their land, by weakening their industry, by eliminating colonies, and by reducing their armed forces. France wanted to reduce Germany to a third world country to ensure that they would never be in a position to threaten French security again. It has its logic, but there are dangers when you reduce your neighbor to such poverty, particularly where things like commerce and trade are concerned, and we'll talk more about that later. Germany should never be able to, as I said, threaten French security again. Clemenceau also, behind his motive was this desire to restore France to its former glory. Now, what I mean by that is not like military glory, not Napoleonic glory. France for many, many years was the epicenter of diplomacy. All European nations, generally diplomats, had conferences and they all were expected to speak French. The reign of Louis XIV and the building of the Palace of Versailles. Many nations tried to emulate French architecture, certainly Peter the Great in Russia when he built his Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. He modeled it after Versailles and so on and so forth. So there was this kind of sense that the French wanted to kind of restore what they feel they lost. France in the post-World War I period is very similar to the Russian Republic in the post-Soviet period, right? They too, Russia, wants to be respected, maybe a little bit feared, and they want to gain that status that they'd lost when everything came to pieces for them in 1991. So, former glory is a dominant power of Europe. So, all right, well that's Clemenceau. Once again, 1841 is when he was born. 1929 he passes. Now look at Lloyd George. Lloyd George is 22 years younger than Clemenceau. And once again, there is that sort of fatherly figure kind of, now listen young man, I've been around the block a lot longer and you need to listen to what I have to say. Now I should note that Britain and France's interests were certainly more in line with each other than, say, the USA and Britain or the USA and France. So, and I'll talk about why that was the case shortly. David Lloyd George was not as inclined to be as harsh as Clemenceau. We have to consider the geography of Europe. I mean, as I said, when the Brits went back home, they could retreat back to their relative comfort and sense of safety on their island nation. So their feelings towards Germany are almost equal to the geographical location in which they found themselves in proximity to Germany. So it's kind of interesting that way. However, the problem with Lloyd George is that he'd just been elected to office after his party had promised to hang the Kaiser and, quote, squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeaked. You wouldn't see this kind of thing in a newspaper today, but this was not uncommon in some of the English newspapers, for that matter even the North American presses as well at the time. So he had been elected on a mandate that he was going to go to Germany and get revenge, even though that went against much of his better instincts. He was more concerned with post-war stability than revenge. He was a pragmatist. He was a pragmatic imperialist, which almost seems like an oxymoron, but he understood that if we reduce Germany to poverty, aren't we kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, because we want them to buy our stuff and we want to be able to buy their stuff. So he understood that despite the fact that Germany people were angry, they were still a community of nations that needed to have economic relationships with each other. So Lloyd George and the British were also concerned with reducing Germany's naval power. Now this shouldn't be a surprise, because Great Britain was always dependent on their navy to maintaining their vast colonial network. They were also interested in maintaining a navy for their defense. So, and they didn't want or like any neighboring nations to have a navy that could compete with theirs, because naturally it would make Great Britain feel vulnerable. So that was number one on their list. We need to eliminate Germany's ability to threaten us through their navy. The other piece was stripping Germany of her colonies would also restore Britain as the world's leading naval and imperial power. Here we go again. Now I don't want to make it sound like the French and British, that's all they're concerned about is, but let's face it, at the end of World War I, Britain and France felt a desperate need to hang on to their colonial network because they were so broke. And they felt like it was like their life support system, that they needed to hold on to, And so I think that Britain and France both share a common interest in maintaining the elements of colonialism that enrich their nations, because they really felt that that was absolutely necessary to rebuild. They wanted to avoid humiliating Germans, so they would not seek revenge. This is very, very interesting. And Lloyd George made this refrain over and over and over again to Clemenceau. Look, man, we can't beat the heck out of these guys. If we do, we are laying the seeds for revenge. And if you look at when Lloyd George passed away, he lived right up until the end of World War II. So he would have seen the rise of the Nazis, he would have seen the years of appeasement, and certainly lived through the years of the war. Not too sure how lucid he was in 45, I'm not sure, but certainly he would have been very well aware of what was happening in the 30s, and I can only imagine he must have just been shaking his head, because in many ways he predicted that Germany would seek revenge if we punished them too hard. And lastly, he wanted to avoid Germans becoming too poor so they would not turn to communism. I mean, there had already been uprisings and a brief Soviet republic, if you could call it that, established in Munich for a while, and Bolshevism was on the move well beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In 1919, the outcome of the Civil War was still unknown in Russia, and he understood that communism was a potential threat for all Western nations where poverty and hardship might be pervasive. So, two very, very important reasons why Lloyd George encouraged the rebuilding of Germany's economy as well. So, Lloyd George and Clemenceau really battled it out a lot, and oftentimes Woodrow Wilson would try to get right in the middle of it, and he would have to withdraw because he just, and so even though they were allies, there was a lot of debate, discussion, and yelling and storming out of rooms and tearing up maps, and this was a huge, huge undertaking, and these three leaders, more than any other in the world, were determining the fate of almost all other nations in the world as well. So, all right, so we get to Woodrow Wilson. He was the American president from 1912 to 1919. He remained a strict isolationist and was re-elected in 1916 with an election slogan that read, "He kept us out of war." I mean, had it not been for unrestricted submarine warfare, which the Germans would implement in 1916, I believe, and the intrigues around what was called the Zimmermann telegram, I think the United States would have remained isolationist right to the end of the war and would not have been involved. But it was those two things that finally got them involved. And as I said here, unrestricted submarine attacks and the intrigues revealed in the Zimmermann telegram. So basically, unrestricted submarine warfare meant that the Germans basically were no longer going to navigate who's who in the water. If you're in the North Atlantic and you're heading towards Great Britain or France, we're shooting you out of the water. Now, from an American perspective, this is like almost like a passive-aggressive declaration of war. I mean, they didn't actually declare war on the U.S., but you're kind of saying it in this way. The Zimmermann telegram was a little bit more worrying because it was a suggestion, an invitation sent from Germany to Mexico City to suggest that, should they decide to join Germany in the war, that perhaps they could carve up certain elements of southwestern United States to share. And as I've said before, it's a ludicrous idea, no offense to Mexico, but they were in no position, nor are they today, to go to war against the United States. So even making that suggestion is quite preposterous. But for the fact that they had the audacity of suggesting something like this, the Americans had no choice but to declare war. When Woodrow Wilson gets to Europe, he's the first sitting president to ever travel to Europe. That means going to Europe while he's president. here he is, filled with American idealism, filled with a kind of Presbyterian righteousness. He was sort of a professor from, I believe he taught at Princeton. He comes with a great deal of sort of, I don't know how to suggest it, sort of naive idealism. Like, we are going to swoop in and spread the virtues of American democracy and all national self-determination for all peoples, and so on and so forth, in the 14 points, which we'll look at. I think that Britain and France looked at Woodrow Wilson as like, oh man, here he comes. He's got his head in his clouds, just kind of smile and nod at him. We do need him, you know, the Americans are pretty important in all this, but, you know, just be polite, you know. And there was a lot of nagging that went on, as I said, between them. I remember once that, Lloyd George was asked, you know, what's it like trying to negotiate and work with Woodrow Wilson and George Clemenceau? And Lloyd George said, well, you know, it's kind of like finding yourself in the middle between Jesus Christ and Napoleon. You know, I mean, it's a pretty strong statement, you know, and he makes his point, you know, you're the moralizing crusader and then the militant, uncompromising warrior. You know, and then Clemenceau himself said, you know, well, so what do you think of Woodrow Wilson, you know, and his 14 points? And Clemenceau says, yeah, well, God has his 10 commandments and Woodrow Wilson has his 14 points. We shall see, you know. So, you know, there was a lot of that kind of thing that went on behind the scenes. So, anyway, here's a perfect example of Wilsonian democracy, if you will, idealism, maybe. August 1917, Wilson declares this. Now look at the date, August 1917. This is a year and a half before the end of the war. We believe that peace should rest on the rights of the people. Great or small, weak or powerful, their equal right to freedom and security and self-government, and to participation upon fair terms in the economic opportunities of the world. The German people, of course, included, if they accept equality and not seek domination. In August of 1917, by this comment, this declaration, Woodrow Wilson was suggesting that if you guys stop this machine now, we'll all be treated as equals. And there were people in the Kaiser's military who were saying, hey man, Wilson says we're going to be treated as an equal if we stop this war now. Let's stop this thing. And of course, the Kaiser, unfortunately, a little bit too proud, a little bit too vain, he was not going to just suddenly stop the war. I mean, you know, you can't stop midstream after everything that's happened, right? So the decision, of course, was to continue the war. So, but there was an opportunity. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had they agreed and decided to sign an armistice in August of 1917. All right. And finally, number 4, Vittorio Orlando, the Italian Prime Minister. He was Italy's territorial claims to extend their borders into Austria and to dominate the Balkans after the war. God knows why anybody would want to dominate the Balkans. No offense to the Balkans, but it had always been a difficult place. His desire to dominate the Balkans after the war were rejected, and the Treaty of London in 1915 was nullified. Okay, this is the central reason why Vittorio Orlando and the Italians bailed out, stormed out of the conference, and packed up their bags and went back home. At the beginning of the war in 1914, Italy wasn't really sure what to do. They were next to Austria, they were very close to the Ottomans. I mean, what side do we go on? And in 1915, while the Italians were waffling on what to do during the war and whose side to take, Britain and France invited them, the Italians, a delegation to London. And when the delegation came, they told the Italians, look, we got a deal for you. We know you guys want to extend your nation a bit by including Italian-speaking peoples that are currently within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So therefore, we would like to suggest, Britain and France, to you, the Italians, that if you join us in a war against the Central Powers, we will guarantee that you get access to those Italian-speaking areas within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, signatures are signed, the Italians go home, they declare war on Austria-Hungary and Germany. They fight a brutal war, by the way. The Italian war in the Alps was brutal. That whole campaign, I mean, you look at the novel Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms, actually takes place in the Italian campaigns against the Austrians in the Alps. The problem is that when the Italians come to Paris to say, all right guys, we just want to cash in on your promises of 1915, Britain and France are like, wow, geez, you know, we'd love to honor it, but we got this Wilson guy and he's talking national self-determination, and the last thing we can do is just give you this, so I'm sorry, we can't honor our agreement. So of course the Italians were furious. His lack of gains at Paris influenced his resignation on June 20th, 1919. And, you know, he clashed with Wilson because his territorial claims conflicted with the ideas of national self-determination. That is the cornerpiece of Wilsonian idealism. When Woodrow Wilson, by the way, comes to Europe, there are people from the colonies. Ho Chi Minh came to Paris. Well, I believe Mohandas Gandhi came to Paris. Many, many intellectuals within the colonies of Britain and France came who said, wow, national self-determination, that's exactly what we want. Britain and France, or Clemenceau and Lloyd George are like, oh, Wilson, could you shush up about this national self-determination stuff? Like, you're firing up all our colonial peoples, you know, and they all want national, so you gotta just tone that down a bit, you know. So, I mean, right off the bat, national self-determination was completely incompatible with colonialism, and Britain and France were in no position, nor did they have any desire of simply releasing their colonies to national self-determination. So, the anger and disillusion of their losses, that is the Italian losses at Paris, opened the gateway for Mussolini in 1922. When Orlando comes back and the economy collapsed, people are angry, there's Mussolini at the time, an editor of a newspaper says, aha, I see a political opportunity. Enter Benito Mussolini out of the anger and chaos that existed in Italy in post-World War I period. All right, there they are again. Lloyd George, the pragmatic imperialist, Woodrow Wilson, the naive idealist, and George Clemenceau, the tiger, the fiery tiger. So, well, if you want to understand anything about Wilsonian democracy or idealism, we really have to look at the 14 points. And remember that this is a peace program that he drew up well before the war ended. And, you know, he was very, very passionate. I mean, you can't knock Wilson for his real desire. You know, I mean, he may have appeared naive and idealistic and overly optimistic through the lens of Britain and France, but I mean, he really believed that American democracy, the symbol of their democracy, could bring great hope. And it did bring great hope to so many nations. And the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson is that, you know, Britain and France just beat him down bit by bit by bit, and eventually Woodrow Wilson would kind of cave in one point to the next and found himself bartering and debating over maps, just like old world politics of you know, medieval Europe or something. So, you know, he's kind of a tragic figure that way. But it was a peace program outlined by Wilson in his address to the U.S. Congress in January 8th, 1918. Okay, we're going to go through all 14, so bear with me. I'll try to go through it fairly quickly. Number 1, the renunciation of secret diplomacy. Open covenants openly arrived at. No more Treaty of Londons. No cutting deals on the side. No cutting deals when your allies don't know about it. You know, none of that. And unfortunately, this creates all kinds of problems. If you're in alliance systems and one of the team goes and makes a deal with somebody else without not telling the others, you know, creates nothing but problems. So everything needs to be in the open. Not unreasonable. Number 2, freedom of the seas, right? You can't control the water. Yes, you can control an agreed upon distance from your land. 5 kilometers off your coast Canadian, American, Russian waters. But beyond that, it's open water for everyone to use. Removal where possible of economic barriers, reciprocity we called it in Canada and the US during those debates in 1911 with Wilfrid Laurier. Reciprocity, free trade we call it today. Buy American in the United States. This discussion of free trade continues, and of course we've just signed a new agreement, the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And, it's a constant thing, this debate about taxes and tariffs. So, number 4, everybody put away their guns. Well, that's all fine and good, unless you're French or British and you just fought the most brutal war in human history. You're not just going to throw your guns in the fire and call it a day. There was still a need to, we got to hold on to these things just in case. Number 5, adjustment of colonial claims. This is something that Britain and France really didn't like, and he didn't get into too much details. He just felt, Woodrow Wilson felt, that colonialism needed to change, but he realized very quickly that the reaction he was getting from Lloyd George and Clemenceau was one of defense, so he backed off a bit from that. Number 6, Germany to evacuate Russian territory. And when we look at the Russian Revolution and then the Russian Civil War, a couple lectures down the line, we'll talk about what happened here. Number 7, Belgium should be restored. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really common sense, logical kind of policies, right? Belgium should be restored. They were devastated by the German armies and needed to rebuild and be restored. Number 8, liberation of France and the return to France of Alsace-Lorraine. If you know anything about the history of France and the history of Germany, you'll know that these two provinces have gone back and forth and back and forth. And if you go to Alsace-Lorraine, I was in Strasbourg 2 years ago, and I sort of marveled at the incredible blend between sort of German and French culture there. And, most places they speak French and German, and there's German restaurants and French restaurants, and it's a very interesting mix between the two there. Italian frontiers adjusted along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. So what puzzles me a bit is this kind of suggests that Woodrow Wilson agreed with what Clemenceau was saying, or rather Vittorio Orlando was saying, but because that's kind of what the Italians were looking for. But nonetheless. Nationalities in Austria-Hungary have autonomy. Easier said than done, right? When all those countries, when that empire falls apart, you've got Slovaks and Czechs and Hungarians and Poles and Serbs and Croats and Macedonians, Albanians, and so on, and Bosnians, and you have to, how do you create these nations? Like, oh, there's a mountain range here, there's a river there, okay, boom, there you go, Serbia. Oh, there's another waterway and there's a lake, okay, well, it wasn't that easy because all these people lived in each other's communities. So when you create these nations, are you then demanding that people leave areas where they've lived for generations because their nation is on the other side of the mountain range? I mean, it's very, very difficult. It's not as easy as it seems just to create new nations. Occupation forces to evacuate the Balkans. Free development of non-Turkish peoples within the Ottoman Empire, which was no longer the Ottoman Empire. They collapsed. Creation of an independent Poland with free access to the sea. Oh, the ramifications of this are enormous. I'll show you a map at the end and I'll explain what happens, because essentially by creating this new nation of Poland and ensuring that they had access to the sea, they would cut off East Prussia from the rest of Germany. And so you've got East Prussia kind of alone on its own, and then Poland next to it, then Greater Germany next to it. And that creates a lot of problems. In fact, it becomes the claimed reason that the Nazis would invade Poland in September 1939 to reunite those East Prussians back to Greater Germany, or at least connect them by land. Number 14, this of all the 14 points was the one that Woodrow Wilson, it was closest to his heart, the most meaningful for him. The formation of a general association of nations to guarantee the political independence of all states. You guessed it, the League of Nations. The League of Nations is going to be the place where gentlemen meet and they practice the policies of collective agreements, and it's like the idea of collective security, rather, is a word I'm looking for. We're all going to work together. We're going to avoid conflicts by negotiating like gentlemen and bartering and discussing and compromising. Great idea. And we'll talk later why the League was so problematic. Well, the Treaty of Versailles is one of 5 treaties at the Paris Peace Conference. There were 5 settled at this year-long conference that required a tremendous amount of negotiation. The conference determined the settlements embodied in, here they all are, we're only going to really look at Versailles. Versailles is with Germany, Saint-Germain was a treaty with Austria, Neuilly with Bulgaria, Trianon with Hungary, and Sèvres with Turkey. Of the 5 treaties, though, it was the one in Versailles that received the most notoriety because of the terms it determined on the future of the German state. And I don't think that these decision makers in Paris could have had any idea the long-term ramifications of the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. So, all right, well, while the other treaties reorganized the map in extensive areas of Europe, the main attention focused on the part of the settlement which arranged the peace with the Western powers' principal enemy, Germany. It was signed on June 28, 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors, where in 1871 the German Empire had been proclaimed at the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War. I talk about this quite a bit in my Causes of World War I lecture, and I think for our purposes I should just give a very brief summary. But, France and Prussia went to war right at the tail end of Germany's unification, when the vast majority of German states came together to form the Second Reich in 1871. And when Paris was occupied by the Prussians, they said, hey, you know what, we've united our German territory now, let's proclaim our new empire in the Hall of Mirrors while we're in Paris. And, for someone like Clemenceau, who would have been 30 years old, and he was one of that generation who was devastated about being defeated by the Prussians and insulted by being occupied by the Prussians in Paris, but even more so harboring that tremendous resentment and anger that the Prussians had the audacity of declaring their new empire in the holiest and most sacred building in France, the Palace of Versailles. So there's a lot of anger, and this is the thing with France and Britain. It's just like revenge begets revenge. Revenge never ends, right? Someone's got to be the bigger man and stop it. Mahatma Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. And boy, oh boy, that statement couldn't be any more clear when it comes to this back and forth that went between Britain and France. So, here we go. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Number 1, terms include a full surrender of all Germany's colonies. They had some in Africa. Surprisingly, they had some in China. Shantung province in China. They also had a couple of islands in the South Pacific. The return of Alsace and Lorraine to France, that shouldn't be surprising. Hitler would take it back, of course, and then the French would get it after World War II, and it's been that way, and hopefully it just stays that way forever. No more of this back and forth business. Parts of East Prussia and Upper Silesia would be given to Poland. Once again, I'll show this to you on a map at the end. Occupation of the Tsar under French control. The Tsarland is in the Rhineland area on the French border, and it's very, very rich in coal. And I think the French knew that when the Germans were going to be given this big bill, this reparations bill, they weren't going to have the money. So France was going to ensure that they could take the raw materials and extract resources from Germany in order for Germany to pay for the reparations. Demilitarization and occupation of the Rhineland, so there would be French and Belgian troops on the left flank of the Rhine, and it would be deemed a demilitarized zone. This is where it gets murky. Germany has to pay 33 billion US dollars in reparations. Now, here's why I think this is problematic. How did they come up with this figure? How do you quantify the amount of soldiers that died? I can understand how many heads of cattle were killed, how many acres of land was destroyed, and you can multiply the amount of productivity that you could take from an acre and multiply it by however many acres are destroyed and so on and so forth. But, you know, when you're talking about paying for a war, it's very, very murky, but 33 billion US dollars is what Germany was expected to pay. There was a ban on any union between Austria and Germany, which was called Anschluss. You might recognize some of these things. If you've looked at or studied the Years of Appeasement, the rise of Hitler, you can see how Hitler is checking off. The Tsar, occupying the Rhine, refusing to pay reparations, Anschluss. The Treaty of Versailles becomes the centerpiece of how he mobilized German opinion and support behind his cause. Right? So, a clause where Germany accepted guilt for causing the war, which we'll look at, the war guilt clause. Of all the things, the money, the land, the resources that were lost and taken away, the most galling thing, I think, for the German people was the war guilt clause, which basically, well, I'll read it to you next, which basically holds them entirely responsible for the war. So, limit Germany's army to 100,000 men with no conscription. You know, my students have asked me before, why on earth give them any? Why just say you can't have an army? And I say, well, why would it be important that Germany has 100,000? And a lot of students can't really piece it together, but at the end of the day, with the threat of communism, the threat of revolution, the Allies wanted to make sure that, if need be, Germany was in a position to suppress social disorder within the boundaries of their own country. So 100,000 men seemed to be sufficient for something like that. Okay, this is the map I wanted to show you. Now, if you look at my red dot here, I'm going to go over this is the outline of the old Greater Germany, right? It went all the way around here. Okay? This black part is what's called the Polish corridor. And this becomes part of the new Poland, so they can have access to the sea at Danzig. Now these Germans here, the East Prussians, are disconnected from the rest of Germany. You can see Alsace-Lorraine here is taken away. Upper Silesia becomes part of Poland. This all becomes... So a lot of these are German-speaking peoples that end up within Poland. Now, aside from all the complex details, we don't need to go that, but let's look at this. The principal German losses. 100% of her colonies, gone. 80% of her pre-war fleet, gone. 48% of all iron production in Germany, taken away. 16 of their coal, 13 of their territory, 13%, and 12% of Germany's population found itself now in the borders of either new countries or in demilitarized zones or occupation areas. So a significant change to how Germany looked. All right, here's Article 231. All right, I always thought this sentence could use editing. Seems like a run-on sentence to me, so I'll take a deep breath before I read it. But this is the way it was written. This is called the War Guilt Clause. The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war, imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. The short version of this: you are responsible for this war, and therefore you're going to pay for it. And as we said before, unfortunately the war guilt clause and the punitive nature of the Treaty of Versailles leaves a very bitter pill in the hands of many Germans, and it was the perfect scapegoat for emergent right-wing nationalist groups to exploit, i.e. most notably the Nazis. All right, well, that being said, that will be the end of this lecture. We're going to move into a group of lectures dealing with Russian history. However, first lecture will deal with a very clear explanation of what Marxism and Leninism is, in order to give us sort of a mental framework, an ideological framework in understanding the thinking of the Bolsheviks and later the Communist Party of Russia. So either way, thank you very much for continuing to view my lectures. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much.